Hi everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. If you've been enjoying these videos that I've been doing the past few days, I don't know about enjoying, but if you found them informative given the circumstances that we're talking about, please do consider supporting my work and finding other videos that are exclusive on the Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. A lot more of these type of videos and anything that I'm not going to be able to cover, not going to have time to cover because I'm trying to keep these to about 15 minutes, 20 minutes max. Anything that doesn't get covered, of course, there will be additional content on the Patreon page talking about whatever subjects I leave out. So, anyway, I'm recording here on the evening of February 27th. It is Sunday. It is 8 p.m. here on the East Coast in the United States, and a lot of developments today to go over. As I've kind of been saying in recent videos, I'm shying away from doing too much in the way of military analysis here. There are conflicting reports, and it really does depend on whether or not you're, in the sort of pro-Putin kind of Kremlin propaganda camp. If you're in the NATO is great and the U.S. definitely are for sure 100% not imperialists camp, you could have very extremely sort of polar opposite interpretations of what's happening. I choose to sort of ignore most of that chatter, and instead, I'm really kind of interested in some of these political questions. And so, let's talk about some of the political questions that are at hand today. Again, the most important development, and I don't even know if this had even been brought up yesterday when I recorded, but the most important development is the potential for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, specifically the Russian government and Zelensky, and whether or not, well, first of all, the nature of the discussions. And there's sort of two tracks here. The first is the question of a ceasefire, even if it's something temporary. And then the second is the broader negotiations to sort of bring about an end to the conflict. Both of those are up in the air. Now, the latest news was that Putin had made this offer. Zelensky had agreed. And then, for various reasons, Zelensky seems to have either walked back his agreement to, enter into these negotiations, and or he's kind of been, cajoled to walk those back. It remains to be seen. Now, the reason I bring that up is because there are competing propaganda narratives that need to be addressed here. Again, one of the things I hope I'm doing is being helpful in helping people to sort of parse through competing disinformation narratives, because that is really what we're watching happening in real time here. And I'm going to talk through, I guess, both sides of the disinformation narrative, the divide, as it were. But let's just talk very quickly about the nature of the talks. First of all, there was a report that Putin and Zelensky would be meeting, or at least their representatives would be meeting, and that was almost immediately followed by reports that Putin had officially notified the armed forces that the nuclear arsenal was on high alert. Their deterrence system is on high alert now. These things, I think, pretty clearly are related, right? Certainly, the Ukrainians feel that way. I believe it was their foreign minister, or maybe it was Zelensky himself, who basically said that this talk of the nuclear deterrence being on high alert is merely a negotiating strategy. I think there's probably a lot to that. I think it also needs to be noted that this is really, again, an indication that Putin feels he is not really negotiating with Zelensky and the Ukrainians so much as he's negotiating with the United States. At least from his perspective, that is the ultimate power here, and that is who he needs to send a message to with the sort of talk of nuclear weapons. Does that mean that he's really sending a message to, insane and deranged war hawks in the United States who are talking about military confrontation with Russia? I doubt it. I don't think he takes those voices so seriously. I think instead he's trying to demonstrate the cost, political and or military cost, that would be inflicted on any powers that seek to sort of meddle, as he might call it, in Russia's operation in Ukraine. Now, the meddling, I don't think Putin is worried that Biden or anybody else is going to send in their troops, but I do think he's concerned about getting bogged down due to advanced weapons that might be sent into Ukraine by the U.S. and its European allies. So the talk of the nuke was, I think, at least in part, about sending that message. Now, I would argue that the real substance of what Putin was doing, that is to say, the real message that is being sent, is not a message of deterrence. It is an indication of weakness. It is an indication that Putin recognizes that he is coming to a negotiation from a position of weakness. And I think that Zelensky is coming from a position of strength. And I'm going to explain why I think that. Every minute of every hour of every day that this operation goes on, Putin's position gets weaker and weaker and weaker, primarily because the actual impact of what he's done, political impact, economic impact, whether it's internationally or domestically for him, all of these cut deeper and deeper every minute as an increasingly unpopular war becomes ever more unpopular. And this is something that we have seen in the United States over a longer period of time, obviously, with Iraq and other examples, that getting bogged down in this kind of a disastrous war, it's never going to go well in terms of public opinion. And Putin understands, to some extent at least, that he is constrained here coming to the table. And I think he thinks that Zelensky understands that as well. Zelensky, for his part, absolutely is coming from a position of strength. Here's somebody who, a few years ago was on TV cracking jokes and is now, an icon of resistance, a hero in all of Europe, a hero to much of the world. I mean, this is somebody who is definitely going to be able to play up this sort of heroic icon status that has been fashioned for him by historical circumstances here in the last couple of days. And I think that that is really what is at play here. Zelensky, despite the fact that his life is in danger, despite the fact that the country has been invaded, paradoxically almost is coming from a position of strength, because it is Putin, not Zelensky, who has to race against the clock. And I think that this is really what this comes down to. Now, part of the reason I wanted to bring this up and to sort of elaborate on this for a second is because the narrative coming from Kremlin's propagandists is really interesting and it is instructive. And actually, this is the inverse of this narrative is coming from the NATO propagandists as well. So, but in any event, the RT Sputnik Kremlin crowd is basically now saying that Putin offered negotiations. Zelensky accepted those negotiations. Then the United States made a statement that it questioned whether or not this could be, legitimate negotiation while bombs are falling. And all of a sudden, Zelensky walks it back, right? And here is tangible evidence that Zelensky is a U.S. stooge, that he is nothing more than a proxy for Washington. Okay, one can make any kind of argument that one wants about who might be pulling the strings and what the motivations are. And it's absolutely plausible that Zelensky's been on the phone with Washington, and Washington has given its recommendation that you not go forward with those negotiations. But what's the reason? Right? There could be a number of reasons. There could be questions about Zelensky's security, the security of his team. Could this be some kind of a trap? Obviously, that's a very basic concern, right? There's also the question about whether or not this is something that needs to be pushed forward right now, because again, Putin is the one who's about to be bogged down in a potentially disastrous conflict. Zelensky is more or less okay until he's hunted down individually. He comes from a position of strength where he doesn't have to make any concessions. It is Putin who is ultimately going to have to make concessions. What concessions will he demand of Zelensky? What, that Ukraine says absolutely no to NATO? No reason for him to agree to that. Zelensky, I mean, that he, push away from the European Union and towards Russia. Not a chance. Not after this. In other words, Putin has boxed himself into a corner diplomatically where what he's really looking for, I think, is to save face in some way. And Zelensky, for his part, if he were smart, would give Putin some way to save face and to put an end to this war. But Zelensky may not simply be after an easy out of this conflict. He may be after something much, much larger than that. And that could be actual victory in this conflict. And what would victory over Russia look like? It would look like Zelensky refusing to come to the negotiating table until Putin has made concessions and turning the tables, right? Turning the tables on Putin. Anyway, I don't want to, I'm not really big for, big macho power politics games or the analysis of big macho power politics games, but I think it is important that we, separate the conclusions that the sort of Putin Kremlin propaganda camp would reach, namely that Zelensky is a US stooge and a US puppet, separate that from what seems to be the only evidence that they're providing, namely that Zelensky's walking away from potentially the negotiation, at least right now. I don't see that one proves anything. I think that if anything, Zelensky is showing a tremendous amount of understanding of leverage and power in negotiations. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Nazis again. Nazis, obviously, a major subject when it comes to Ukraine. And today we saw glowing tweets from the Nazis of Azov Battalion talking about how they were, dipping their bullets in lard in preparation for the Chechen soldiers who are supposedly coming to Ukraine to, do Putin's dirty work. Now, this is very interesting because it kind of, again, overlapping disinformation narratives where the truth actually or where it's rooted in some truth, right? The Azov battalion is absolutely part of the defense of Ukraine. It is part of the armed forces. It's a sort of an adjunct of the armed forces proper, and it is absolutely a Nazi outfit, a neo-Nazi far right outfit. And yet, what are we to make of sending in the Chechens? Did Putin not know that this would be the problem? Or did Putin maybe know exactly how Azov and others might react to the Chechens coming in, right? These Islamic, quote unquote, barbarians, right? Orcs, as the Azov battalion Nazis were calling them, right? Racializing the conflict, bringing out this sort of Nazi character of certain segments of the Ukrainian defense forces. This is part of propaganda, Putin's propaganda game here, right? Putin says he's going in to denazify. All of a sudden, 3 days later, things look disastrous for Moscow. And what does he need? He needs Nazis, and he needs them fast. Okay, so I think, again, we have to be very, very, very mindful and skeptical and wary of all of the information that we're seeing from all sides here. It is critical because we are being victimized by war propaganda. And we cannot be accepting war propaganda, whether it's fashioned by the Kremlin or fashioned by the United States, etc. All right, I want to just talk about the CIA here. Here's another narrative that I think needs to be addressed. I know talk about the CIA in Ukraine, right? And this is basically supposed to tell you that the current government of Ukraine in the year 2022 is little more than a CIA puppet regime. Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that because the history of US intelligence operating in this area is not as clear as some people might like to say it is. Yes, of course, the US in the post World War II period gathered up Nazis and used the Nazis as part of the intelligence apparatus and, well, in various aspects of the US state, both intelligence and science and others, using Nazi assets as a part of the anti communist sort of trajectory of US foreign policy and US, tradecraft, as it were, I guess, right? And so the Nazis, and Nazis and former Nazis, they figured really centrally in what the CIA would ultimately become and what U.S. intelligence would become. All of that is true. All of the connections with the various Ukrainian nationalist organizations that had collaborated with Hitler and ultimately got scooped up and connected with U.S. intelligence. There's a very, very long and sordid history of all of this, right? And then you start to get into territory that becomes a bit murky because once you agree that yes, all of that is true. And yes, Ukraine has long been a hotbed of anti Russian, anti communist kind of intelligence maneuvering. Once you get past all of that, you're then left with okay, and how does that connect to today? Well, we can definitely point to, a general connection to the far right in Ukraine. And certainly it's in keeping with how the CIA operated in Eastern Europe and other countries in Latin America, where they fostered also the fascist right, et cetera, right? So these things align with each other, right? But just because they align in a general way, it doesn't mean that the actual people in positions of power are currently operating under the orders of the CIA. This is where the left begins to look stupid. This is where you cross the line from having a smart analysis rooted in facts to having a stupid conspiracy theorist analysis that's rooted in things you pull out of your ass, right? We have to be very, very careful about adhering to some standard of truth here. Yes, of course, the Nazis in Ukraine are absolutely a problem. They do have influence at the state level. They infest every element of society, and it's something that has to be dealt with. But the idea that the entire government of Ukraine, including the democratically elected Zelensky government, which, by the way, Ukraine has far more transparent and democratic elections than Russia does. I mean, just take a look at the elections in Russia in 2021, widely understood even by not so anti Putin forces as being totally rigged against the various opposition parties, including the Communist Party in Russia. Anyway, the point being that the idea that the CIA controls Zelensky or that the CIA is calling all of the shots in Ukraine, this is simply not supported by anything other than the assertions of people who point to 70 years of history. Yes, we know the history of the CIA. It is a despicable organization that should be dismantled, and the people in charge of it should be tried for crimes against humanity, both those that are currently alive and those dead in the past decades. But that doesn't mean that they control the current government of Ukraine. I mean, we have to be serious, folks. We have to be serious. All right. Let me just talk a little bit. Oh, and by the way, this idea that the CIA controls the government in Ukraine completely ignores the fact that there are oligarchs in Ukraine that actually control the government in Ukraine. Right? That the government of Ukraine is essentially a combination of various failed and corrupt institutions with full of failed and corrupt bureaucrats who are more or less representative of the power blocks that support them, whether it's Timoshenko or previously Yanukovych or the Kolomoisky gang or whatever it might be. There's a bunch of these, parasites, and they have each of them have their own political formations, political expressions, and some of them do dabble with the far right and use them as political muscle, as organized gangs or whatever, right? But the picture is complicated. It's a complicated place because it's a complicated world. Bad America and bad CIA controlled bad Ukraine is not exactly an analysis, and I think we really do need to be careful about not sounding like dumb assholes, particularly to people in Ukraine who know a little bit about their country. All right, last thing I'm going to say here. I'm already pushing 20 minutes. Anti-war protesting going on in Russia. Very, very interesting. I'm not sure that Putin counted on this. I think that they thought they had enough control over the information space and had created enough political repression so that the protests would be more muted than they have been. Now, I don't mean to say that these are mass scale protests, that Russia's facing general strike or anything like that. There remains a tremendous amount of apathy, a tremendous amount of confusion, even within Russia about the situation. But I had seen a report that today, my time here, it's Sunday evening, February 27th. On Sunday, February 27th, reports of roughly more than 2,000 arrested in Russia protesting against the war, bringing the total since Thursday over 5,000. Now, in some ways it's a lot, and in some ways it isn't. If you're an activist here in the United States, and we've seen what kind of repression we face with Black Lives Matter protesting, or protesting against drone facilities or whatever. I mean, they'll throw you in prison for years. They'll give you felonies. They'll attack you. They'll beat you. They'll hit you with beanbags in the eyeballs, and all of the horrendous things that have been done to pipeline protesters, and climate activists, and transgender activists, and Black Lives Matter actions, and all of these things, right? So we are familiar with repression, and I say all of that because I don't want to fall into this really chauvinistic, jingoistic trap that I see a lot of liberals falling into, right? That somehow that we're speaking from a superior society. We're not superior to Russia. Russia is an autocratic regime. This is a neoliberal regime teetering on the brink of fascism. We are a global wrecking ball that's destroyed country after country, that still can't even look itself in the mirror with any sense of clarity, right? So as somebody from the United States, I speak without any level of condescension about what's going on in Russia versus, the United States. But it should be very clear that there is very real repression in Russia, and these numbers tell me that there are probably hundreds of thousands of people whose sentiments are being expressed by the relatively small numbers of people at these protests. This is a very, very, very encouraging development, because Russia, as I've said before, is a somewhat depoliticized society for a lot of historical reasons. They're not generally going to turn out for protest outside of, the traditional sort of liberal intelligentsia. And now we're beginning to see broad sections of Russian society coming out. This is very, very interesting, very worrying development for Putin, I'm sure. So much more to discuss. I'm completely out of time here. If you want to go over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/Eric Draitser, I'm going to talk a little bit about the British pulling out of Rosneft and what that means as far as energy, as far as trade, the banning of RT and Sputnik in Europe. This is a huge development that really, really deserves some attention and a little bit of discussion. And then interesting statements coming out of Turkey about their shift in position on what's going on in Ukraine. Remember, Turkey didn't call this an invasion in the first couple of days. Now they may be shifting their tune. Why? What is Erdogan up to? Go over to the Patreon page to find out. If you enjoyed these videos, I have more coming in the future. Support my work, support Counterpunch. Really appreciate it. Talk to you again soon.